George Galloway and the mother of all talk shows. Welcome to the Open University of the Airwaves with George Galloway.
There's an active shooter engaged at Tallahatchie High School in the U.S. state of Georgia. Many dead, many wounded. So far, they haven't blamed it on the Russians, but Russiagate has been reinflated for takeoff in the run-up to the US presidential elections. And the Russians have identified as active shooters in the shelling, rocketing, sending of missiles at civilian targets in Russian cities. And the culprit they have named is the United Kingdom of Great Britain. There's no sign of an end to the active shooting in Gaza. Of course, in that case, it's the shooting of women and children in a barrel because they have no ability to run away. The endless peace process that lasted from the Oslo Agreement until now is replaced by endless negotiation about a ceasefire that never comes. But on the Eastern Front in the Ukraine, the Russian armed forces are destroying all before them. And it can only be now a matter of time before Zelensky is gone. Half his cabinet has resigned this day. Oh, and in the conservative disabled donkey derby, not so pretty Patel falls at the first fence. It is the mother of all talk shows. Stay tuned.
Curious about our curriculum? Have something to say? Then call us now to join the debate on the mother of all talk shows. The only education you can get for free. George Galloway. The mother of all talk shows. With George Galloway. The world is our classroom, and you're welcome to sit in and join the seminar.
You know, things are getting decidedly difficult for the Democrats in the presidential election race. Not only are they falling actually substantially behind Donald Trump in all of the swing state contests, not only are they falling behind on the national opinion polling, but they have dug out the corpse of Russiagate, the discredited husk of the Russiagate allegations from 2016 and 2020. They have disinterred the bones of the idea that the Russians are conducting active measures on a massive scale to influence the outcome of the election. The fact that the President of the United States, for the 16th straight day, is on a deck chair on a beach in Delaware, while international crises multiply and deepen. The fact that cackling Kamala Harris, the next in charge, is on the campaign trail and not, as was said by AOC, devoting endless hours and sleepless nights to bringing about a ceasefire in the Middle East. The fact that the inflation rate in the United States for groceries is some 25% in the period of the Biden-Harris administration. The fact that the United States is riven with social, cultural, racial malaise, such as the malaise of massacring children in their schools on an almost monthly, sometimes weekly basis. These are all apparently the result of Russian interference. The fact that AIPAC, a foreign agent organization, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, has just announced that its spending in the current electoral cycle has passed $100 million. Now there's election interference, and they boast that every single candidate that they supported with that $100 million was successful in their primary race. Now that's what I call election interference. Hunter Biden's laptop may not, as it turned out, have been Russian disinformation, But stand by, they're on the hunt for more. They're raiding houses with the FBI, armed officers of journalists who've had the temerity to work in the past on Russian media platforms. I think that the desperation in this new turn in the US presidential election will be forlorn, because it seems to me, if ever a party looked like a corpse, it's Joe Biden's Democratic Party of the United States of America. And Trump appears to have found his mojo. And Robert F. Kennedy Jr. coming on board seems to me like a game changer. But we'll be discussing this and much more with some of the best guests you can imagine in the course of this show. The active shooting at cities and civilians in Russia is indisputable. No one can dispute that the ordinance involved was made in England. In fact, the Russian Foreign Affairs spokeswoman, Maria Zakharova, today identified the precise two factories in Newport in Wales where the munitions were constructed. The fact that the software on the munitions, on the drones that are killing civilians in their cars, in their gardens, in their shops, in Russian cities, was programmed, apparently, according to her, by British programmers, means that Britain has gone to war. I predicted that Keir Starmer would take Britain into war within 6 months of achieving office, and so exactly he did. Within 6 months, we entered the war, not just in Ukraine, we entered that a long time ago, but the war in Russia itself. The Russian foreign minister has stated publicly that Russia considers Britain to be equally culpable for these civilian deaths caused in the Russian cities by long-range weaponry supplied by Britain and by drone technology programmed by Britain. They now regard the Zelensky regime and the British government as co-responsible for those deaths. They say that there will be a reckoning, but that the algorithm for the nature of that reckoning is still in play, and that in any case it would plainly not be in their interest to announce it. So brace yourselves, Britain. Our government has taken us to war with a hypersonically nuclear-capable state, which is winning its war with NATO and is ready for a reckoning with some NATO partners, with Britain now preeminent amongst them. British Parliament was never consulted, never mind informed of this turn of events, and frankly, not many British members of Parliament would have been interested in participating in the discussion if there had been. But the British people and our legitimate interests abroad may very well now be adversely affected in the extreme. But the war's going very badly for NATO. The Russian front against the Ukrainian forces in the Donbass is now proceeding at such a pace it is frankly impossible to keep up, never mind learn how to pronounce the names of the towns and the villages that are falling not just daily now, but hourly. There is a full-scale, pell-mell scramble of Ukrainian forces in retreat in the face of this Russian advance. The writing is on the wall, not just on the front, but in the home fires that are now beginning to consume the Zelensky administration. Half of Zelensky's cabinet resigned today. Members of Parliament are beginning to resign. The dogs of war in the Ministry of Defense, rogue officers, rogue former defense ministers are beginning to circle Zelensky. When a war begins to go wrong, there are not many who will remain absolutely loyal to the person that took them into the war. People begin to calculate of their own best interests, sometimes even the nation's best interests, in what should be done next. So NATO, in desperation, is supporting what are essentially terrorist acts. They would be terrorist acts if they were taking place at the hand of anyone else and anywhere else, and they are terrorist acts when they kill old ladies in their gardens in Russian cities. Imagine weaponry costing tens, scores, sometimes hundreds of millions of dollars is being expended on killing shoppers in Russian cities you've never heard of before. In no conceivable military universe can any of this make any difference at all to the outcome of the war. As a matter of fact, the inverse proportion has now begun to work. The more effort that's put into terrorist acts on Russia, the more the Russians advance against the NATO-backed Zelensky army in the Ukraine. And it may not stop where it once might have stopped. The chronology of this is important. As I argued heavily at the time, if the Minsk agreements, the second Minsk agreement, guaranteed by Germany and France, and then later by the Security Council of the United Nations, if the Minsk agreement had been implemented, 100% of the national territory of Ukraine would remain part of the national territory of Ukraine. There would have been no war, no invasion. If the Minsk agreements had been genuine and acted upon, there would be no Ukrainian war. There would have been no blowing up of the Nord Stream. There would have been no disaster in the German economy. There would have been no rise of the AfD in the regional elections in Germany. European gas prices would be a half or less than half of what they are. There would have been no war, no casualties, no crisis that takes us to the brink of World War III. But the Minsk agreements were a deception. It is now clear. They were never meant to be implemented. So the invasion happened. And then there were talks in Istanbul, and an agreement was reached between Russia and the Zelensky regime. In Kiev, their negotiators initialed a peace agreement, which would have been more than Minsk II, but way, way, way less than where we are now. Boris Johnson was ordered by the American government to go and tell Zelensky that up with that NATO would not put, and that no such agreement could be concluded. And so the war went on. And trillions of your tax dollars, pounds and euros, were spent. Nord Stream was destroyed. Germany plunged into cold and deindustrialized, increasing poverty and national division, even chaos on the streets of Germany, and the rise of radical political parties that would have had no look in at all in the German political scene if it were not for this war in Ukraine. Think about that. And then Moscow offered over and over again peace talks. And those peace talks would have taken place with the Russian armies hundreds of kilometers back towards Russia than they currently sit. And so, as the war dragged on, and the terrorist campaign in the Kursk Battle of the Bulge and other attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure in Russia, if that had not taken place, then a negotiated settlement might have been able to be reached that would have been far more advantageous. But now, why would Russia negotiate at all with Zelensky? If Zelensky is overthrown and a new government emerges that is serious about denazification, denatoization, and a recognition that the old Ukraine is gone for good, maybe this war can still be brought to a conclusion in a way that does not entail the effective end of a Ukrainian state altogether. But now the Russian war aims are bound to be expanding, bound to be increasing, and any agreement will be far more disadvantageous to Ukrainian nationalists, to the Zelensky comprador, and to their NATO armorers and financiers. But we'll talk to Chay Bowes, one of the best informed men. I was going to call him an Englishman, but of course he's an Irishman. But in English language terms, he's by far and away the best informed analyst of what's happening in Russia and in Ukraine, anywhere to be found. But let me turn to the ongoing crisis in the Middle East. Israel murdered their own hostages again in Gaza. You must know that because the faces of the hostages have been on the television screens ever since. They've been on the front page of all of your newspapers ever since. Of course, neither the television nor the newspapers tell you that Israel killed those hostages. They repeat the Israeli lie that the Palestinian resistance murdered those hostages. Well, neither you nor I were there, but it strikes me as simply bonkers to imagine that Hamas would kill hostages who are worth more than their weight in gold in transactional terms in exchange for Palestinian hostages held by Israel. But we weren't there. We don't know what happened. But what we do know, and it's being told to us by some of the most senior Israelis in the land, that Netanyahu does not now and never has had any interest in freeing those hostages. First, because he won't pay the price. They paid 1,000 prisoners for Gilad Shalit, 1,000 political prisoners for one man, but they are not prepared to release the list of Palestinian hostages, including high-value hostages like Marwan Barghouti. They are not prepared to release those hostages back into the legitimate political sphere, but mainly because the goal never had anything to do with freeing hostages. It had everything to do with continuing the genocidal onslaught, which will not end if he can achieve it until every last Palestinian has been removed from Gaza or otherwise extirpated, annihilated, destroyed, their blood draining into the forlorn sand of the Gaza Strip. That's the game. That's the goal. And they have fallen so far short of it that it's difficult to see how Netanyahu, having waded thus far into this river of blood, can decide whether to go on or whether to go back. If he goes back, it's the end for Netanyahu and a probable prison term as a result. And so on he wades, and no one from amongst the plethora of politicians in Western countries who've paid for the whole thing, who've covered for the whole thing diplomatically, who've shilled for the whole thing in every corridor of the mass media world, there's no sign that any Western politician is prepared to force Netanyahu to stop wading through the blood of the Palestinian people. Iran has not spoken yet. But it may speak tonight. It may speak tomorrow night or on Sunday. Who knows? But that Iran will speak seems impossible to doubt. The Iranian state's prestige, the Islamic Republic's honor, requires a response to the egregious mass murder in Gaza, mass murder in Lebanon, and the proximate reason, the cold-blooded murder of a special guest of the Islamic Republic, Ismail Haniyeh, the leader of the Palestinian negotiating team with Israel in these hostage matters of which I have spoken. So when Iran speaks, does the balloon go up? And if it goes up, who tries to shoot it down? And what role will the Western governments, having had a beating in Ukraine, want to play in the Persian Gulf and in the Levant? On that subject, we're about to speak to Ghadi Francis, author, journalist, and war correspondent, and one of our most popular guests ever here on the mother of all talk shows. Fasten your seatbelts. It's going to be a bumpy night because it is the mother of all talk shows.
A new dawn has broken, has it not?
He had that Clinton thing. His eyes were round and big and smiling, and he was very charming.
He became this incredible pop idol kind of prime minister.
I think most people who have dealt with me think I'm a pretty straight sort of guy, and I am.
New Labour was backed by the most powerful media interests because they realised he was representing them.
He was caught red-handed trading policy in return for hard cash from a businessman.
America has no truer friend than Great Britain.
Both Bush as well as Tony Blair are now wanting to plunge the world into a holocaust.
JP Morgan paid him off for the Iraq war. The man is a war criminal.
Is Tony Blair a war criminal? In my opinion, yes.
Most definitely.
The pursuit of money has become the dominant theme in your life.
All these relationships are, in most people's estimation, corrupt relationships.
No previous Labour Prime Minister has behaved in this shameful, money-grubbing way.
How do you sleep at night? You know, it's that. It's as a person.
Now you get that film, The Killings of Tony Blair, and our second film, third actually, The Killing Kelly, The Strange Death of Dr. David Kelly. You get them free of charge if you support me on Patreon. I've just recorded and it's now in post-production my first in a series of short histories, the short history of Yasser Arafat, and that will be going out on Patreon. So support me on Patreon because you're supporting the mother of all talk shows if you do, and it won't cost you more than the price of a cup of tea in an insalubrious cafe. Patreon.com/George Galloway, and get those two movies as a bonus. Should Britain suspend all arms sales to Israel? We only ask because David Lammy, the Eddie Amin of British politics, at the dispatch box, admitted that he was going to suspend only 9% of all British arms licenses to the Netanyahu murder gang, meaning that more than 90% of all British weapons sales to the apartheid state are going to continue. Well, you voted for him. You voted for them. But should Britain suspend all arms sales to Israel? It's a simple question. Yes or no? You want to be involved in genocide or not? Yes or no? You can vote on my Telegram channel, t.me/George Galloway, on my X, my Twitter, on the YouTube community poll, or on the YouTube stream. So far, 22,258 of you have voted, and I'm only now announcing the poll. You've got about an hour and a half to get your vote in. Should Britain suspend all arms sales to Israel? Yes or no? And if you want to call the show, it's toll-free in the US and Canada, +1 844 944 3344, and free of charge in the UK and Ireland, 08081 965522. And for those in the rest of the world, which, let's face it, is most of you, it's 44203 966 2625. Ghadi Francis, one of my favourite guests, author, journalist, and war correspondent, and she's seen her share of war. joins me now. Ghadi, thank you. Let's start with the Philadelphia corridor. Not many people knew of it before, though I've crossed it many times myself. The Israeli sticking point, they say, in the negotiations taking place between Doha and Cairo is that they intend to remain in control of essentially the border between Egypt and Gaza. But that may just be a ruse. It may just be that with an American election underway and now heating up, they just want to allow the Americans to pretend that a ceasefire is possible and that the US leadership is doing all that it can to bring it about. What's your reading of that situation?
Hello, George. It is always an honor to converse with you, and thank you for considering me a favorite guest. It is also an honor. That being said, to start with, I think the latter is the case here. I think they're just trying to buy time and to make things look like that. Because, I mean, let's talk about it. Who doesn't know that the whole of Egypt is controlled one way or the other by what the Israelis want? So it's just like bluffing. They have done nothing to say that they really have any intentions of actual negotiations. They have killed their own hostages, and they have killed the top negotiator. They assassinated him in Tehran. Yesterday, in the past week, we have seen Netanyahu speak about Palestine as if there's no West Bank. They have an ongoing genocidal machine inside Jenin, Tul Karim, and also even in Christian Beit Lahem. They are raiding people's homes with illegal settlements and always confiscating their. Today they just confiscated the tent of the protesters protesting in front of their homes after they've been taken by settlers in Beit Lahem. So that all being said, we're not even at a stage where we can consider them people who have any regard or respect to any kind of law, international law, human law, law of prisoners, Convention of Geneva. There's nothing that they respect. So it's only really frustrating at that point that even the whole world is even listening to what they're saying. These are people who have to be in jail, just to say the least. These are war criminals. This is the most documented genocide in the human history. And we're still here sitting and discussing and negotiating. What does Benjamin Netanyahu want? Benjamin Netanyahu needs to be in a prison right now. And if it's not for the good of the Palestinians, it's for the good of the humanity. It's primarily for the good and the safety of the Jews and the Judaism and the future of this world. This is being done in the names of Jewish people, which is not the case. The first and foremost people who are suffering because of this genocide is Judaism and the Jewish people all around the world, because this is not going to end here. Blood does not end when you kill people, when you kill a girl rollerblading, for God's sake, in Gaza, and all the world sees it. When you kill doctors, when you rape prisoners, when you burn people in their tents, when you bomb hospitals and schools one time after the other. Nobody's going to disregard this. Nobody can lie anymore. They're trying to bluff. The media tries to bluff every day, but it's not controllable at that point. So what you said while asking the question, it is the latter. Yes, because there is this chaos around the world in the politics, and they would gain some time, and they would like for it to look like, okay, the Americans are doing the good job. But as they are trying so-called negotiations in Doha, they're just arming Israel and bluffing about it in the media and talking about the 6 Israeli hostages killed by Israel in the same day that more than 50 Palestinians are dying and being killed and massacred and raped. They're speaking about, I don't know how many hostages remain alive after Netanyahu killed them. They're speaking about this amount of humans when more than 7,000 Palestinians are detained without any reason. These are humans as well. So it's just outright frontline, very unapologetic racism at that point. And anybody who tries to say otherwise is also a racist.
Yes, it's we now know everything about the recently deceased hostages. who were killed the other day. We've seen their faces. In fact, one can't avoid their faces. I know what all of them look like. I know their names. I know their family backgrounds. The fact that 67 Palestinians were killed on the same day, who are completely nameless, faceless, with no biography, no life history, the fact that no one even pretends that their blood, even all 67 of them, was worth anything like the blood of the 5 Israeli hostages, is essentially racism. There isn't any other way you can describe that. If the blood of one group of people is so vastly more valuable than the blood of another larger group of people, it can only be because one is a lesser human being than the other. Seriously. You can't look at it any way, can you? Any other way.
Exactly. And George, I'm so angry that I can't even talk about it anymore. How is it normal that it's almost a year into that genocide and people are still discussing it? How is it normal? How are we supposed to carry on our lives? And every day you talk to the media, you know the stories of these people, and we are just like in a relationship. Let's give this example. In some relationships, people make themselves smaller to be loved. We are at a stage in this 76-year worth of war where we have agreed that we are lesser humans. We are in the pattern. The way we report our news is like 200 Palestinians have been killed. 6 hostages with these names and family stories have been killed. We even do this. I just lost it. I don't want to be politically correct. No, every human matters. Alice in Beit Lahem matters. Yasmin, every single girl that is being killed, Maryam that is still surviving, and every day I check her father's Instagram to make sure that Maryam and her father and her brother are still alive and giving us that feed from Gaza. These people are not only equal. I'm done with being politically correct. We are more important. We are the indigenous people. These are the indigenous people. These are the Semites of the world. These are the people who are directly and genetically related to Jesus Christ. The ones that are being massacred by people coming from Poland and most recently from Brazil, from the United States of America. These people are invading Palestine, this holy land, and killing the indigenous people. And if you want to talk about racism, and if you want to talk about superiority and supremacy, I think people who have survived 76 years of all kinds of persecution, they are way more important than myself, George, and anybody who's been entitled and have dual passports and have been, spoiled all their lives. They are more important because they are stronger, because they have survived that, because our conscience is also complicit just because we didn't do anything to save them. So I think not only we shouldn't look at ourselves as smaller and subhumans, I think it is time to just say things as they are. We are more important. And even if they're killing us today, in the future, this is never going to be like, there's never going to be stepping over all that blood. It's never gonna work. And every day when you look at what's happening inside the streets of Tel Aviv or what's happening inside the Knesset, or even on the military front, how they're fleeing or being or resigning or bullied outside of their positions because of their failures. And when you look at all these days of war and genocide, and you also look that there are still rockets coming out from Khan Yunis to Rafah, to Deir Balah from northern Gaza as well, you can understand that first, Netanyahu did nothing. He succeeded in nothing. 2, these people were not defeated. And 3, this will not end the war. This is just another round of Palestinian resistance. And on the long run, this is only going to lead to the liberation.
The essential reason why we are still in this situation almost 1 year on is, of course, the gross imbalance of military power, the military and political power and determination that exists between the adversaries, the aggressor, and the victim of that aggression. The Palestinians have fought a phenomenal battle with the limited resources that they have. There has been a steady war of attrition across Israel's northern front, conducted by the Lebanese resistance. There have been sporadic and spectacular examples of solidarity from the Yemeni people in the Red Sea, from the Iraqi resistance, for example. But none of that can be sustained or is being sustained. None of the maximalist ideas that you and I discussed the last time we met on Have It Out with Galloway, none of that has occurred. And Iran hasn't spoken yet. Do you expect Iran to speak? And with what force do you expect them to speak?
First of all, I want to tell you, on the day of Arba'in, when Lebanon retaliated, the day that 320 Katyusha drones, they call them Katyusha drones, like missiles, hit different bases, and when the Galilot base near Tel Aviv was hit by Hezbollah, and the way that this retaliation was orchestrated, where the Israelis said, that's it, we're not gonna carry on. The way that all this played out gave all of the Lebanese people a sense of, respectively, serene week. We are feeling way more secure after that retaliation. And it is also just the manifestation of why the Lebanese people do trust their resistance, because they lead this war pragmatically, taking into consideration what comes next with a lot of high intelligence. And with the leadership is very patient and strategic. And when we speak about the Hezbollah retaliation, in speaking about Iran, I'm just trying to say that this comes from a very similar school in military. And if Hezbollah is patient this much, Iran is patient this much. So Iran does not work on a clock. I suppose the Iranians think of the next day, and I suppose the Iranians know that the whole trick that Benjamin Netanyahu is trying to do is like to escalate as much as possible, to drag on as much as possible the West and the Western hegemony against Iran, and to make it all sound like it is a Western war against the Islamists in the region, and maybe the world would forget his failure and his genocide. This would be a win situation for Netanyahu. So I suppose the Iranians do know how to measure their retaliation. It is impossible for them not to retaliate, not for anything, just because they are the Islamic Republic of Iran, and they have shown us since 1979 who they are in the region and how they act and how their retaliations are. Some of the analysts went on and started thinking that the lone wolf operations that are inside Palestine today, and I'm speaking inside Jerusalem today, that started all of a sudden or were resumed in the past weeks, they might be one shape or the other of what Iran would do. The ways that the Iranians would retaliate is not about ego. This is the difference. Benjamin Netanyahu is an empty war criminal with a very big ego in the last days of his political career. Iran is it's a republic, and they don't think about one person or their ego. They don't care if me and you are celebrating the retaliation. They care about the actual retaliation and the deterrence. And I suppose it's not about a clock. They do have a very big calculation. And when you look at the supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, is speaking about the possibilities of resuming nuclear talks or so on, you might think that the Iranians do not have a rush in what they take and how they retaliate. But I do trust the experience in analyzing and looking at them in the Middle East and looking at their struggle and their fight with the Israeli presence and the Israeli occupation of Palestine. And I think every day that they make the Israelis wait is a day gained for them, in a way. There's a narrative here that they say, and many of the people that we speak to that are resources around Hezbollah or the Islamic Republic of Iran's diplomats or presence in Lebanon, or the analysts or the press people that we meet and ask as journalists, they have this way of analyzing that I find a little bit logical. every gained day is a win, because every day the Israelis are waiting for the attack, and every day there's more and more military problems, internal problems, Israeli problems, whether it's between the ministers or even on the military front. So this disturbance that they have caused is also one of the points that they consider wins. So according to their dictionary that we spoke about in your show the last time we spoke in Have It All Out with Galloway, we spoke about the Iranian dictionary, and their meaning of deterrence and their meaning of retaliation is not also what we are used to from how the Americans or the Europeans work. And I tell you, in the Iranian dictionary, they don't care about the ego. They just care about what the Israelis are doing. And I think since the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh till date, if we just look at what's happening between Netanyahu and his other genocidal maniacs, I think the Iranians are way better than what's happening inside the streets of Tel Aviv now, or even in the military bases. So I think in one way or the other, Iran is getting there, but it's not how we think will happen.
Ghadi Francis, thank you as always for your wisdom and your experience. Thanks for joining us on the mother of all talk shows. Should Britain suspend all arms sales to Israel? Yes or no? It's a simple question, really. And you can vote on Telegram, t.me/George Galloway. Please follow me on Telegram, on my Twitter, on the YouTube community poll, or on the YouTube stream. Quick break, and then it's your calls. Stay tuned. There are some key metrics that very few people have yet fully grasped. This show attracts an audience exponentially higher. I mean, like multiples, more multiples than I could calculate. The written press, behind paywalls, which nobody buys. If you've ever recently been in a supermarket and seen the unsold copies, you already know nobody buys newspapers, and nobody much is prepared to pay a paywall to read stuff that they know intrinsically, instinctively. They know that they're being lied to, that it's propaganda, that the owner is not even in the business of actually selling. He's in the declining business of influencing opinion in the country for his, maybe not often her, political point of view. So first of all, why would I want to be appearing on television channels whose audience is minuscule, except when I'm on it? You think I'm boasting? Take a look at the metrics. Take a look. When I'm on, when I'm not on, you'll see the difference in the audiences. So why should I help them get audiences? We need to be our own media, and increasingly we are.
You are listening to the mother of all talk shows with George Galloway.
Let's go to the lines where Terence is in England, in Corby, wants to talk about Corby. Jeremy Corby. Go ahead, Tel.
Good evening, Mr. Galloway. I hope you were well. I think I've liked that the Guardian commented on Jeremy Corbyn is joining what could be described as a ginger group with 500 independent MPs, and the Guardian, I think, described it as a Muslim press group, complete poppycock. The control of the narrative, the nonsense. Even the Guardian has degenerated. That's the first point. The second point, Mr. Galloway, I was watching the Paralympics and I saw an Israeli Paralympian receiving his medal and crying at the anthem, and I had to turn it off because I felt sick to my stomach, not for the man celebrating, but for the very the very effrontery of that being on the television when what's happening, and Mrs. Francis, or Miss Francis, the lady you just talked to, was so passionate. It was wonderful to hear it. I'd like your thoughts on both, please, Mr. Galloway.
Well, first of all, on the Israeli athletes, that's the point that Miss Francis was essentially making, that the first victims of all of this are the Palestinians, of course, Christian and Muslim alike and equal, but the second victims are the Jewish people in Israel and indeed across the world. If there is anything resembling the upsurge in anti-Jewish feeling, hatred even, and sometimes morphing into vandalism and violence, then it's hardly surprising, given that the crimes of Netanyahu are claimed by him to be being carried out in the name of not just but the Jewish state. Now, we completely reject that nomenclature. More importantly, so do millions of Jews around the world, either religious Jews who have never supported the state of Israel, let alone acknowledge that it is their state, that it is a state of the Jews, the secular, oftentimes irreligious Jewish people around the world who simply are revolted by the crimes of Netanyahu. So we reject that nomenclature. But of course there are fools, idiots everywhere that will see a Jew or see Jewish property and desecrate it or offer violence and hate towards ordinary Jewish people in Britain or France or anywhere in the world, which is utterly ridiculous, insane, stupid, criminal, all of these things and more. But the one thing it isn't is a surprise. The fact that these crimes are being committed against defenseless women and children in the West Bank and in Gaza and in East Jerusalem is bound to lead to hatred, not just of the state of Israel, but of anyone thought to be in support of their crimes, even where that thought is entirely wrong. There are heroes from the Jewish communities in the front line of every demonstration everywhere in the world for justice for Palestine, and God bless them all. Corbyn has joined with 4 Muslim MPs who were elected as independents in the general election on the 4th of July, and they formed a parliamentary alliance. That parliamentary alliance gives them equal numbers to Nigel Farage's Reform Party, for example, and therefore ought to get them equal amount of time on television, but it doesn't. Ought to get them equal amount of state funding to support their work, but it doesn't. Ought to entitle them to at least the same level of respect that Reform or the DUP, for that matter, who've also got 5 MPs, 5 Reform, 5 DUP, 5 Independent Alliance. They should all be treated equally, but they are not. And as you say, I only quarrel with the use of the word even when you said even The Guardian. Never was an even more otiose than in relation to The Guardian, especially The Guardian, slandered these independent MPs and by extension their constituents who elected them as Islamists. Islamists. Jeremy Corbyn is an atheist, a white atheist from Norfolk. By what metamorphosis does Jeremy Corbyn become an Islamist? Now look, on the podcast, we are this week #1 in Kuwait, Bahrain, Malaysia, and Gambia this week. #1. mother of all talk shows. You can download the MOATS podcast by scanning the QR code on your screen now. Breaking news, we're now hearing at least 4 people have been killed, 9 wounded in the Apalachee High School shooting. The suspect is in custody. That was in the state of Georgia. Simon is in the state of Florida. He's from Weaponized News, which any sensible person is already following. Simon in Florida, a legend. What would you like to say?
Greetings to you, Mr. Galloway, and to your worldwide audience. Well, there's a great deal going on in the world today. We've got the official start of the Forum on China-Africa cooperation occurring in Beijing. And in advance of the official start, there have been African leaders from across the continent flying in and having personal meetings with President Xi Jinping. And it was very interesting that the Kenyan president compared their experience where they've been greeted in the Hall of the People in central Beijing personally by the president of China, having been driven there in a Chinese-made limousine, that when they went to the similarly named America-Africa conference in Washington, D.C. in 2022, they were all packed onto a bus together and presented to Biden as if they were a class of primary school children. So there's an interesting difference there. But the Chinese foreign minister, Mr. Wang Yi, had put out a letter that frankly is so long it has numbered paragraphs, just to give your audience a flavor for that. And it is, however, critically important, so much so that for that and for the speech given just 2 days ago by the Russian foreign minister, I dedicated the time over the last few days to make an hour documentary, one about the Chinese letter and one about the Russian speech, that, as you so kindly recommended, people will be able to find on weaponizednews.com. But Mr. Wang Yi has explained the incredible significance of this meeting, which has almost every single leader, with a few exceptions for countries that have forthcoming presidential elections, meeting both collectively and one by one with the president of China, who's been progressively upgrading the rank of their diplomatic relations between all the countries, and talking not only about the Belt and Road Initiative, but also the Global Development Initiative, the Global Security Initiative, and the Global Civilizational Initiative, that form the 4 legs of the chair of Chinese foreign policy, and indeed its vision for a shared future for mankind going into the new era, as President Xi is so keen to describe. And what was interesting was in this very long letter, essentially President Xi, as he met with each African leader in his greeting, he was basically reading out one paragraph of the letter. Then the next leader would come in, greetings, welcome, etc., then read another paragraph. So bit by bit, he basically stated Chinese foreign policy. And this may not have been obvious to all the viewing audience. That's going to continue until Friday. And at the very same time, we've got the Eastern Economic Forum occurring in Vladivostok, the far, far eastern side on the Pacific of the Russian Federation. And before attending that via Mongolia with President Putin, Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, went to his alma mater, his previous university, at the Moscow University Institute of International Relations, and addressed the faculty and all the graduate students there. It is one of Russia's most prestigious universities, the equivalent of Oxford or Cambridge or Harvard or Yale. And he gave a 70-minute address going through the Russian foreign policy concept that he explained from 2023, that he explained that when they graduated and joined the Foreign Service, they would be tasked to implement. He also explained how Eurasia was being formed into the greater Eurasian partnership in parallel with all the Chinese initiatives. But what was interesting, and this is sometimes the little sneaky thing that once again gets overlooked by much of the people who do stumble across such an event, was that he was asked where he liked to vacation. Seems innocent enough question. And he described southern Siberia and the high mountains, the largest of which is Mount Baluka. Seems a random enough comment. That, however, in both Hindu and Buddhist legend, is the gateway to the mythical kingdom of Shambhala, where in theory all the races will live together in prosperity and harmony. So perhaps a
Amen. We all need to find that gate, Simon. I'm cutting you short because I want to ask you one further question. Turkey, it is said, is applying to join the BRICS. Now, I personally will believe that when I see it, but how firm is that intention, at least at this point?
No, we're now told that they have formally, in writing, submitted an application to join BRICS. But the big problem is that's being run by consensus. Now, even though Turkey is blocking Israeli participation as a partner in NATO, it's putting them in an increasingly untenable position, both the proposal that they be in BRICS and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, both of which are essentially becoming allied against the global billion represented by NATO. So whilst they've always expressed the view that they're a bridge, indeed there are many bridges across the Bosphorus and the Dardanelles, it seems that that's going to be very hard to achieve. Now today, for the first time in 12 years, and obviously there's been a lot of bad blood regarding the Muslim Brotherhood in the past, we've got the president of Egypt meeting with the president of Turkey in Ankara, and rather than sending some diplomatic flunky to do the pleasantries and formalities at the steps of the aircraft, President Erdogan went himself and greeted President al-Sisi at his aircraft. And they put out a long statement talking about all the common positions that they have regarding Palestine. But it's all part of the iron triangle forming, which is Egypt, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Iran. And just today, we've got the Iranian foreign minister in Riyadh, the capital of Saudi Arabia, literally saying in rather flowery Arabic language that the sky is the limit for the new relationship between Saudi Arabia and Iran. So overall,
a new era indeed, a new era. Simon, look forward to the next episode of Weaponized News. Sounds like it's going to be a cracker. Thanks for joining us. Some comments. Jack Klugman, wonderful name. It's the largest concentration camp in history. Extermination camp, he says, in history. And Lammy stopped the shipping of safety pins. Nicola Curtin says, can we assume Richard Medhurst is in a safe country, such as Russia, right now? Nicola, if I knew, I couldn't possibly tell you. Big Basil, well, Russia is one of the few places Richard would be safe from the Western abomination. And Patrick Fox says, this supposed 3-day pause to vaccinate Palestinian children against polio will never happen. You may be right. Thomas is in England, in West Sussex, on the Israeli hostages. Thomas, what would you like to say?
Hi, can you hear me?
Mm-hmm. Go ahead, sir.
Great. Well, George, I was taken aback somewhat by the statement you made earlier. You suggested that the IDF murdered those hostages as opposed to Hamas. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I do remember you saying on many occasions that you do not support Hamas because you do not believe Hamas is good for the Palestinian people. So why would you give credence to these individuals who you do not support, who you do know are murderous, by saying that the Israelis killed the hostages as opposed to they killed the hostages? That's one question. And if you don't,
well, I'll tell you why. I'll tell you why, Thomas. You're a supporter of Israel. I am not. But you're entitled to your say and I'm entitled to mine, and I'm entitled for you not to put words in my mouth. You can replay what I said at the beginning, and you'll find that it's a little way short of how you described it. But as you ask me, here are the reasons. Israel and its supporters have lied and lied and lied and lied and lied and lied throughout the entirety of this 11 months. That's my first reason. If an Israeli state spokesman told me that today was Wednesday, I would have to confirm it from other sources. They are inveterate liars. Their ideology is based upon a lie. Their whole state is built upon a lie. That they were a people without a land and that Palestine was a land without a people. Well, we've had many years, 76 and counting, to discover how false that is. But that's only my first reason. My second reason is this. Israel have murdered their own hostages in the past 11 months. And Israel condemned its armed forces unit and disbanded it today, and dismissed its commanding officer today for executing 4 Israeli hostages, holding a white flag, one of them with flaming red hair, all of them speaking in Hebrew. Israeli soldiers murdered them, believing them to be Palestinians who can be murdered at will and on sight. So that's my second reason for saying what I said, which is not what you said I said, but what I said. Israel are liars, and Israel has murdered its own hostages just in the last 11 months. But the third point I want to make is this, because I know that's the real reason for your call. I am not a supporter of Hamas. I have never been a supporter of Hamas. I'm a supporter of President Arafat, whom your friends murdered. And I was at his deathbed in the Percy Military Hospital in Paris. I've just finished a podcast about it. Your friends murdered him precisely because he was not Hamas. Your friends asked Qatar to keep funding Hamas. Your friends, not mine. Matter of record, in document, asked Qatar to keep funding Hamas. Not me, your friends did that. But my support for Arafat and for his political son, Marwan Barghouti, in a dungeon held by your friends, not mine, your friends, in no way validates the words that you attributed to me. I'm not a supporter of Hamas, but not for the reasons you attributed to me, not at all. And in the bottom line, I believe the Palestinians alone must have, do have, the legal and moral right to choose whichever leadership they choose, whether you like them or whether I like them. Look, let me take a quick break because you've got my blood boiling, Thomas, in West Sussex. If you know, you know.
Hello, George. I heard Neil Kinnock commenting on you losing your seat, okay? I was disgusted and amazed at what he said. He was like an ignorant football supporter. He actually punched his fist in the air, saying he was delighted that you were gone, that you were a horrible person. That's the first thing he said. When he was leader of the Labour Party, he was conniving morning, noon and night to kick you out of the party. Now, this is before Tony Blair, and you were in good standing with the Labour Party. Mr. Kinnock, that chap just totally disgusted me. So what I think the British have to do, and the Irish and everybody else, is they need a new conversation and stop drinking Coca-Cola and Pepsi. And I think all those people in British civil society, including Jeremy Corbyn, Diane Abbott, Ken Livingstone, and very many more, have to have a conversation about how to wean the British and everybody else away from these Coca-Cola and Pepsi parties.
Nobody knows who Neil Kinnock is. Those who know who he is know he's the man from the Welsh Valleys that betrayed the miners. Frankly, the hatred of Neil Kinnock I wear not even as a badge of honour, a little tiny pin maybe, because pretty soon no one will have heard of him at all. But the wider subject that you raise is the important one. I don't know, Jeremy says he doesn't want to form a party. That's fine by me. I've got my own party. I'll be staying in it anyway. But what I would like him to do is to announce a new popular front, like the one that has just, I can tell you officially, won the French parliamentary elections.
You are listening to the mother of all talk shows with George Galloway.
Should Britain suspend all arms sales to Israel, yes or no? Vote on my Telegram, t.me/George Galloway, on my X, my Twitter, on the YouTube community poll, or on the YouTube stream. 23,170 have voted so far. Let's take a call from Germany, which is descending prematurely in September into what's going to be a long, cold winter. Malik in Germany. What's your point of view tonight, Malik?
Good evening, Mr. Galloway. I want to talk about polio in Gaza, but before I do that, I just want to say that I have heard you mention a couple of times the success of Sarah Wagenknecht. She is a thoroughbred. She's a thoroughbred left socialist, but she does not even speak about Israel and what's happening in Gaza, which is very disappointing. Mm-hmm. But so I will come to the main point about polio in Gaza. I heard you say that the Israelis are also at risk, but that's not true. I, as a biologist, can tell, I'm not expert in polio, but I can say something, that polio is not airborne. Its transmission is fecal to oral. That means dirty water. And this has happened since the people in Gaza don't have any water to drink. So also, for example, now they are vaccinating, but it will not help because you need to have a couple of doses of polio to be able to get some vaccination. And I have a feeling that Gaza had no polio for the last 25 years, and it had been eradicated. So it must have been introduced from outside, and I presume that Israelis are behind it. This is what I wanted to say.
Well, you just said it came from dirty water, and there's a surfeit of dirty water in Gaza, right?
Exactly, but that means the dirty water, people when they are not have good hygiene and proper conditions, so that means there must be some people with polio infected, which are producing this all the feces and all the things which is mixing with the water. But Gaza had no polio cases for last 25 years. So how come in a prison?
No, that's right.
How come in a prison there's an outbreak of a polio which nobody has? So it must come from outside. Do you understand what I mean? And
well, there's thousands of Israeli soldiers that have invaded Gaza. It could have come from them. It could have came from someone amongst the Palestinian population who'd come from outside. It could have come from anywhere, but it is there. A child died of it, and everything must be done to stop it from spreading. And my only point was that a 3-day truce is, first of all, not remotely enough time to inoculate more than 1 million children in Gaza. Secondly, who's going to inoculate them? Who's going to produce the product with which they are inoculated? And fourthly, what is the moral point in inoculating a child against polio only after a short truce to deal death and destruction on the head of that very same child and her mother and her father? Look, I've got Chay Bowes, the legendary political commentator, master of arts in geopolitics, and nowadays to be found in Moscow, and the best informed analyst, commentator on events in Russia and Ukraine in the English language today. Chay, welcome to the show. Let's start in Ukraine, if we may. Reports, and I've seen them from you and from many other sources, that as much or as many as half of the cabinet of Zelensky have resigned today. Are these the last days of the dictator Zelensky?
Well, hello, George, and thanks for having me on. Again, always great to hear from you and great to hear your voice. You're a very important voice of dissent and of justice, and God bless you and long may you continue your work. Regarding the recent resignations and sackings, now we know that with Dmytro Kuleba, who's the Minister of Foreign Affairs, the most senior diplomat in Ukraine, and I've done a lot of research into this. He was basically, thrown under the bus. He was told he was leaving. We don't know exactly the details as to why, but he, along with a raft of fairly senior government ministers and deputy prime ministers, including those for European and NATO integration, for the reintegration of, temporarily occupied territories, as the Ukrainians would call it, meaning Crimea, people in the Ministry of the Environment, a huge raft. We think about 7 so far in the last 48 hours basically have gone. But Kuleba is by far the biggest fish of these. Interestingly, also, the head of the Air Force was sacked after the loss of the first F-16 and its very, very precious pilot. Rumours that it was the American Patriot air defense system that actually shot it down. No, nothing from the Russian Ministry of Defense here, so we have to look into that very carefully as well. And Zelensky wields the axe very quickly. He's a very tempestuous character, we believe. He's also a man now who is isolated among his own cabinet, we believe. And we were told this by General Zaluzhny's people when he was axed. So it doesn't, as you know, as a veteran politician, this doesn't smell of stability. And it comes at a time when this Kursk misadventure, exceptionally costly, well over 8,000 Ukrainian men have been killed in Kursk, according to the Russian Ministry of Defense. Absolutely needless waste of life, as is all of this wasted life in the absence of a peace plan, which we know our friend Boris Johnson and other dynamos of this conflict in London have been eager to prevent peace. Huge amounts of Western material lost in Kursk. Terrible acts of brutality against the civilian population, attacking civilian farm workers, bombing cities and towns, as they are as in Belgorod and Bryansk as well. And then in the east, we have a exceptionally fast, rapid advance westwards by Russian shock troops, if you like, around Pokrovsk in the Donbass region, enveloping towns and villages. I mean, the amount of towns and settlements being taken on a daily basis now, it's actually hard to keep up with. Western media, of course, isn't talking about that, but they're very carefully now introducing the narrative. Is this gamble by Zelensky in Kursk a wise one? Is he losing in Ukraine because he's winning in Russia? When the Western sort of client media, and we know that the Western media, the mainstream narrative, is centrally controlled, when they are even openly and adopting a very cautious tone about this, last roll of the dice by Zelensky, and then we see these high level, very rapid purges in Zelensky's group, and in very important regions and areas. The head of the Justice Department gone as well. So it doesn't stink or smell of stability. It doesn't bode well. And as winter comes in Ukraine, the energy infrastructure has been targeted, we know, and you won't see, that's not the end of that targeting, I would imagine. Russia trying to target critical infrastructure to try and bring the military industrial capacity of Ukraine, who are advertising that they're bringing in Rheinmetall from Germany to build tanks, that they're building a long-range ballistic missile with which to attack Russia and Moscow and St. Petersburg. Russia has responded by attacking that infrastructure, as they did in Poltava, attacking a big electronic warfare training base. So all of these things, if you zoom out and look, it doesn't look good for Vladimir Zelensky. A lot of people predict, Ukraine is on the verge, it's on the edge. Remember, Ukraine has over 50 countries funneling huge amounts of cash, weapons, and moral, political, and of course financial support, as I say, into Ukraine. So anyone predicting that Ukraine will collapse in the next number of days, months, weeks, I think is somewhat naive, because I think the West will escalate its aid in order to prevent the terrible vista where people like Ursula von der Leyen, Boris Johnson, Joe Biden et al. And his group of regime change advocates, to prevent them having to actually say, look, we got it wrong in Ukraine. We destabilized the country. We got into bed with some very nasty characters, as is par for the course with the CIA regime change. They get into bed with anybody to inflict what they believed was going to be a strategic defeat on Russia. The Russian economy is growing. The Russian military has evolved and is winning in the east and holding the Ukrainian desperate incursion in Kursk. It's not going anywhere. They're losing a lot of men and material. So rather than have to accept that openly, and particularly in an election year, George, you'll remember the Nixon era, and you'll remember how that war was perpetuated by Nixon because he didn't want to lose a war in an election year. The exact same applies to Kamala Harris, who's recently said that she wants the American military to be the most lethal on earth. They've got trouble in Gaza, as we know. They haven't defeated Hamas. Their proxy, Israel, hasn't defeated Hamas. Russia is anything but defeated. It's actually getting stronger economically. It's not isolated. The Eastern Economic Forum is ongoing as we speak. Over 70 countries represented there. China and Russia have been, if you like, welded together by this ignorant and foolish foreign policy of the EU and the United States as a mega power, basically, nuclear-wise, economically the biggest manufacturing economy in the world, China, aligned with Russia with its massive energy reserves, its continental landmass. This is an exceptionally foolhardy misadventure from the West, but I don't see them queuing up to say, look, we got it wrong, let's have peace. I suggest that they will probably try and escalate and push further and further, that Russia may be forced to do something drastic in Ukraine. I don't see Vladimir Putin, this exceptional statesman and veteran politician, doing anything according to the Western timetable or playbook. He's not going to be, his hand won't be forced, and he's shown that with Kursk. Keep on mission in Donbass, achieve our goals in Ukraine. And people here believe and trust him, and they believe he's the right man for the job, and life goes on here. General Syrskyi, an interesting point, General Syrskyi, the Russian-born and trained commander-in-chief of the Ukrainian armed forces, said about 48 hours ago, he said, look, if our plan was to distract Russia from its massive assault in the east, which is rolling forward over our defenses, the defenses that have been there since 2014, if the plan was to distract the Russians from that stated aim, it has failed. And that's the head of the Ukrainian armed forces admitting that the main reason, the rationale for this suicidal incursion into Kursk was to distract the Russians. It's absolutely failed. So that's coming directly from Syrskyi. Take that with the political upheavals, and you will understand and maybe be able to add to the relevance of that more than me as a veteran politician. What does that mean when a leader wields the axe like that? Take all those things in context, and it doesn't look good. It looks like the walls are definitely closing in on Zelensky.
Well, a night of the long knives seldom leads to prosperity, in my experience. The Zelensky demand that Mongolia should arrest President Putin on his arrival in Ulaanbaatar spectacularly backfired. Instead of being met with policemen with handcuffs, he was met with all the splendor that the heirs of Genghis Khan could muster. Tell us about that.
Yeah, well, of course, the Ukrainians have now said that there will be consequences for Mongolia, this huge country in Russia's east. It borders on theater and sort of it's parody as reality, really. Of course, Mongolia is exceptionally reliant on Russian energy, technology, and trade. And basically what the Mongolians have said is, look, sorry, but we're not sorry. We're not going to enact a grossly flawed theatrical arrest warrant on Vladimir Putin for moving children from a war zone to safety. We're not going to be doing that. It's never going to happen. And of course, in the absence of any sort of action against Vladimir Putin, there was huge pomp and ceremony. The Mongolian mounted cavalry meeting him. It's been a huge PR success for Mongolia and for Russia. And again, this is all in the context of what the Western perception is of Russia. The very isolated think tank fantasy of the West that anybody who borders Russia is really going to tackle it economically or enact one of these ludicrous sort of politically motivated arrest warrants from the international community is absolutely deluded. Trade in Russia is booming. There's a building boom as we speak in the big cities in Russia. There are huge amounts of immigrants coming into the country now, millions and millions of them to work in Russia's industries and services. So you've got a burgeoning economy here, and Mongolia is a part of that. And of course, Mongolian trade has also increased because of the Western sanctions. This is one of the most insane realities, which people like von der Leyen and Borrell will never tell you about, is that countries who border Russia, who are still friendly to Russia, have seen huge increases in their trade into Russia via third countries. Because your Coca-Cola you're drinking in Moscow now has come through Kazakhstan, it's come through Mongolia, it's come through from China. But it's still here. So these self-harm sanctions, they're in many ways defined by the fact that Volkswagen now has this iconic German car manufacturer, one of the beating heart, the engine of the German economy, has announced that it may be shutting its plants. And this is all to do with this dismemberment of the Nord Stream pipeline. But regarding Mongolia, Mongolia has done what's right for its people. And I've written that, and that's what I published on my social media, that maybe the Western powers who are crying about Vladimir Putin should be doing the same. They should be thinking about what about the welfare of our people, particularly coming into the winter in places like Germany, as you mentioned, a dark, dark winter ahead. But Mongolia has definitely, in my view, taken the right side by saying, look, it's a political thing. We want to maintain friendly relations with everybody in the West and in the East, and we certainly won't be rocking the boat with our biggest economic and energy partner on our border. It's not going to happen. Sorry, but we're not sorry.
Well, Chay, Anna Baerbock was very blunt about it. She actually, on TV, said, I don't care what my voters think. I'm doing what I believe to be right by Ukraine. As a veteran politician, I could tell you that not caring what your voters think is definitely not the road to political happiness, as many a politician has found out. But on the subject of Germany, the regional election results in Thuringia and in Saxony were a brutal signal to Berlin as to just how unpopular this traffic light coalition, red, green and yellow, is. And their days are very obviously numbered. In fact, I think the demand for early elections in Germany may not be able to be resisted. And now the AfD were the biggest winners, but my friend Sarah Wagenknecht had a great night in both places and has emerged as the kingmaker in both seats. Her position on the Ukraine war, on Russia, on economic and social fronts is very similar to my own. Talk a bit about how you think that will impact on Germany's attitude towards Russia and Ukraine going forward.
Mm-hmm. Well, it seems obvious to me, and it'll be obvious to you and to our viewers, that often parties like AfD, which get a bad press, of course, as well, they're cast as this radical, the Alternative for Deutschland, they're cast as radical, far-right, dangerous agitators, other parties refusing to go into government with them, which I always find very interesting. That the Christian Democrats, for example, say we will never join with the AfD to create a government. So they completely reject the democratic will of the people. Now, these people who vote for AfD are obviously completely disenfranchised and in disbelief at how the Traffic Light Coalition has completely destroyed and disemboweled Germany's economic growth. Germany is on the precipice of an economic cliff, and this is unprecedented in Germany's history. Even after the two wars, it bounced back very quickly. Germany is now the old man of Europe, and that's according to the German press. Olaf Scholz has become very much a vassal leader when it comes to Ukraine, particularly foreign policy, German foreign policy, which was very independent, very neutral, and very anti-escalatory for most of the Cold War. And in the post-Soviet era, the Germans did try to maintain decent relations with Russia. And of course, the Nord Stream pipeline, this incredible joint venture between Europe and Russia to supply exceptionally high quality, exceptionally cheap gas to German industry and to the rest of Europe, was a huge threat to American hegemony in Europe and the domination of Germany. Maybe the old adage, George, correct me if I'm wrong, to keep the Russians out, to keep the Americans in and keep the Germans down. And this has come to pass very much so when you see what's happened now with America becoming a premier supplier of liquefied natural gas into Germany. So we also had to remember Biden saying that if Nord Stream is open, we will end it, we will cut it off. So this is a big issue in Germany. People are starting to see this huge influx of refugees from Ukraine into Germany, as in my own country. And this is having an impact on the paychecks of the German worker. And when you start to annoy the German blue-collar worker, it's quite a unionized society. It's quite an aggressive labor market, if you like. They don't like their jobs impacted, their ability to spend, and their ability to have the lifestyle they like. The Germans do start to march, and they do start to become quite proactive in this. And now, with increasing electricity prices, which are inexorably linked to the destruction of Nord Stream, which nobody in Germany, Nord Stream seems to be the crime that no one wants to admit it even happened. The victim doesn't even want to admit it happened. And the person who did it is kind of laughing in the background. So this is all part of the elevation of AfD, who have radical policies on immigration. Germany's immigration policies, of course, are all predicated on its post-war position that everyone is welcome in Germany. And that's fine, but you still need to have the social infrastructure to welcome everybody. It's very much the same in Ireland. We have a huge immigration problem because we don't have the infrastructure in our society to help all comers. It's not about racism. It's about simply not having the infrastructure, the doctors, the clinics, the homes, the houses to house these people. It's not the fault of these people, most of whom, and many of which, are fleeing NATO generated wars in sub-Saharan Africa, in the Middle East. So to stop the boats, we need to really stop the wars, George, in my view. And in Germany, they see this in Germany, they see this to end the war in Ukraine is exceptionally important, to bring back economic stability to Europe. But of course, with people like Olaf Scholz, he's very much not the statesman of old, the great German statesman, who actually did put Germany first and say, look, they avoided any kind of escalation. Now we've got German tanks in Kursk again, 81 years later. So it's almost a sort of Orwellian reality has evolved, and the people of Germany have obviously had enough. And of course, with Sarah Wagenknecht as well, an exceptionally talented woman. I've heard her speak several times. Absolute common sense. And one thing AfD and the left have in common now, and as you've talked about this grand alliance of common sense, of focusing on human value, that we end war. It doesn't have to be a left or a right thing. It should be a centralized an alliance thing. And in Germany, it very much looks like it could be that. And thank God we may get some common sense in Germany, because Germany is still exceptionally influential.
Chay Bowes, as always, a masterclass. Thanks for joining us. Coming up after this short break is Briahna Joy Gray, the host of the Bad Faith podcast, former National Press Secretary for Bernie Sanders. They don't get much bigger when it comes to guests. I'll be right back. Stay tuned. If you want to join me on Have It Out with Galloway, you can be the audience member on that video wall so that I can see as well as hear you. Come and have it out with Galloway. Come and have a go if you think you're hard enough. www.haveitoutwithgalloway.com.
You are listening to the mother of all talk shows with George Galloway.
I need you to join me on Have It Out with Galloway. Write an email after this show to haveitoutwithgalloway.com and appear on the show on the video wall. Now, Briahna Joy Gray is a very important American guest indeed. She's now a preeminent host and analyst and a veteran of many a platform, including her own Bad Faith podcast, which is a must listen. But formerly, she was the National Press Secretary for Bernie Sanders in his greatest days, which are sadly behind him. Briahna, welcome to the mother of all talk shows, and you are the mother of all American guests. So let me pay a particular tribute to your work. Over the last couple of years, I've been following you closely. I want you to talk us through where you think the presidential election race stands now, on the day that Russiagate has been resuscitated. The former deputy to the governor of New York has been arrested as a Chinese agent. Are they getting ready to outsource the fault for a coming Democratic Party defeat?
First, I just want to thank you for that very generous introduction. I really do appreciate it. To the question of the state of the U.S. presidential race, I do think you can read into what seemingly is a manufactured resurgence of Russiagate, and also into the spike in focused attacks on Jill Stein and her Green Party campaign, a sense of vulnerability among Democrats who are realizing that the spike in enthusiasm over Kamala Harris taking over from Joe Biden, the enthusiasm that was generated around the DNC has started to wane. They were branding the enthusiasm spike as a sort of brat summer reference to a popular album over the summer, but that doesn't seem like there's much of a plan for what's going to happen in the fall. And I do think that the panic is well-founded when you look at certain polling data, which shows, for instance, that Kamala Harris remains behind in all of the swing states, and additionally, that she's tied with Jill Stein 26% to 26% among Muslim voters who might be the determinants of the election outcome in states like Michigan, which are must win for Kamala Harris. So yes, I do think that you can read into some of the news focus right now, a kind of vulnerability and insecurity from the Democratic Party, which makes me less bullish on Kamala Harris than I might have been if you had asked me what I think is probably going to happen just a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah, I mean, the famous Clinton question, where's the beef? Well, there ain't no beef in the Kamala Harris shtick. It is joy, if you'll forgive the pun. Briahna Joy Gray, you can't win an election on joy, especially when not many people are feeling that joy.
For many reasons. Domestically, people having a lot of concerns about a housing crisis, cost of food, education costs, transportation costs, all of the same problems that are endemic because of deep flaws in our economic system and the economic priorities of both Democrats and Republicans in the United States of America. But it's also particularly pernicious, I think, to be trying to brand herself as carrying the politics of joy when she has been very clear that she is not going to break with Joe Biden's policy with respect to Israel, where a genocide is taking place and the ethnic cleansing regime has moved into the West Bank and not just limited to Gaza. To contrast the idea that you are joyful and hopeful with what is going on under your watch, not just because she's running for president, but because she is currently the vice president of the United States of America, I think is rubbing a lot of voters the wrong way. And while there was a period of time where she could kind of take advantage of the ambiguity around her position and people could project onto her the belief that she was going to be softer toward Palestinians, at least linguistically, the fact that she was kind of forced to state her position in that recent Dana Bash interview when she said unequivocally that she is not going to back an arms embargo. I think that is making a lot of younger voters, Muslim and Arab voters, and other people who are just anti-war, including on the right side of the aisle, very skeptical of Kamala Harris and looking for political alternatives.
Yeah, I mean, who's running America, Briahna? Many of us are asking this. It's clearly not the old guy on the deck chair on the beach in Delaware again. It's clearly not Miss Joy, who's cackling around the country on the election trail. We're in the middle of multiple international crises, at least two of which could lead to World War III. It is a matter of some mystery to the rest of the world as to who's actually running America.
Yeah, I mean, I do think the answer to that question is the same, frankly, regardless of who is technically sitting in the White House. And the kind of absence of Joe Biden from the political scene and the lack of confidence in Kamala Harris as his understudy is just really underscoring the extent to which money runs the United States of America. If you want to see how a politician is going to behave, you should look at who's on their donor rolls. And that is why you're seeing this consistency of policy between Donald Trump, Joe Biden, and Kamala Harris on these key matters, including and principally, as you point out, foreign policy. I think that anybody who's afraid is very right to be afraid, but I don't think it's necessarily just because Kamala or Biden is or isn't at the helm. It's because the same forces of the military-industrial complex that have been leading American policy for since time immemorial, frankly, are the same ones that are driving U.S. policy in a way that is accelerationist in the region, and that doesn't seem to have a lot of concern about the very legitimate threat of World War III.
I would have liked, with all of my heart, for all kinds of sentimental as well as political reasons, to have been able fully to support RFK Jr.'s presidential run. But the atrocity of his view on the Israel-Palestine conflict made that completely impossible. But that doesn't mean I cannot dispassionately evaluate the impact that I think his going over to the Trump campaign may have on the outcome. It seems to me that at least his 5%, and maybe more, at least his 5% will go to Trump. Dr. Jill, my friend, the one I'm supporting, Dr. Jill Stein, is a net loss for the Democrats. Anyone that votes for her is a vote off Kamala Harris. The Democrats are not lying about that. And therefore, for both of those reasons, the way I see it right now, it's Trump's prize to win. He can only lose it now. The Democrats will not be able to win it.
Well, I agree with parts of that and not others. I do think there are a lot of Green Party voters who are Green Party voters or independent voters first and foremost, who might have voted for Bernie and been brought into the Democratic Party because of Bernie Sanders, but are not typically Democratic voters. Bernie performed better than any other candidate in that very crowded 2020 race with independents, and has that particular appeal. And I don't think it's a one-to-one of Jill Stein voters who would otherwise have voted for the Democrat, Kamala Harris, especially in the context of the war in Gaza, which is such a key issue for so many people in this race in particular. I would point out that in 2016, there were more people in Michigan who voted and left the top of the ballot blank. In other words, went to the polls, stood in line, voted for all the down ballot candidates, but refused to vote for Hillary Clinton, then were needed for Hillary to win in that state. So in other words, there were people who wanted to vote and who even wanted to vote for Democrats down ballot, but uniquely didn't want to vote for that candidate. So the idea that the Green Party vote is dispositive in these elections isn't entirely true. There was a similar statistic back in 2000 with Ralph Nader, where more registered Democrats in Florida voted for George Bush than voted for the Green Party. So there's a lot of interesting stuff happening there electorally. I do agree that most RFK Jr. voters were likely to vote for the Republican and the alternative anyway, but I also share your concern that RFK Jr. could have done something really interesting. He could have used the dissatisfaction with the two major candidates at the time, Donald Trump and Joe Biden, to build a third party, to build something institutionally that lasted longer than his individual run, that really presented a challenge to the duopoly. And he chose not to do that. He chose to run as an independent outside of a party structure, lacking the infrastructure to have longevity, making it more difficult to get on the ballot. Now he picked a billionaire as his VP, which made it a lot easier for him to get on the ballot than it was for someone like, let's say, Cornel West, who's been really struggling in that regard, because it does take a lot of money. This is fundamentally a money game. It's what's so unfortunate about politics in this country. That being said, it wasn't enough. He obviously ultimately capitulated. He has a disastrous record on Israel, which I think probably cost him his really amazing first campaign manager, who was Dennis Kucinich, who has been very consistent and courageous on that issue throughout his career. And ultimately, I think a lot of Kennedy voters are asking themselves, how can you be against corruption and money in politics? How can you take a stand against that when your view toward Israel and that particular conflict seems to be so driven by your associations with people like Rabbi Shmuley and more specifically various moneyed interests? Where's the transparency behind your campaign? How can we trust you to govern in the interest of the American people when you were willing to select a VP? I'm sure she's a nice person and all, but the metrics seem to have been who can provide him the cash flow to his campaign to run as an independent outside of a party structure. None of that says to me I'm interested in actually undermining the duopoly or having a long-term impact on American elections. It seems to me to be more about himself as a candidate, which is why you saw him running as I'm a Kennedy Democrat, emblazoned over everything, to I'm an independent, to now I'm with Donald Trump. I'm wondering, what's the ideology? How can we predict what your beliefs are going to be? What's your theory of change? And I think that's why he really struggled in the race.
Now, of course, the last man who could have done all of those things was Bernie Sanders. He was our very first inductee to our Hall of Fame here on the mother of all talk shows. He was our numero uno, but we all feel that he let us down. He and Kennedy, therefore, both let us down. Will anyone save us from the disastrous duopoly of Republican and Democrat in the U.S.?
I mean, I think that's a good question, and part of why it's so important to be focused on organizations that have accountability measures built in, as opposed to individual leaders. I would never have guessed, frankly, and maybe that's my own naivete, and I've certainly learned from the experiences that I've had, that Bernie Sanders would ultimately capitulate the way that he has to the interests of the Democratic Party. I mean, the first evidence of this, the first disappointment, was obviously the endorsement of Hillary back in 2016, instead of choosing to run as a third-party candidate. In 2020, I felt it was even more egregious, largely because he endorsed so quickly, seemingly getting very little in the way of concessions. The oral concessions that he got from Joe Biden to say at least press for a $15 minimum wage were immediately sabotaged by the Democrats in the spring of Joe Biden's first term. And despite those disappointments, those betrayals, Bernie Sanders again endorsed early Joe Biden even prior to a primary season being played out. The Democrats actively suppressed the primary, and you didn't hear a peep about it from people like Bernie Sanders or AOC or many of the other progressives who immediately endorsed and fell in line, even when there was the potential of having a real challenger, even when someone like RFK Jr., for instance, was still in the race running as a Democrat, not to mention Marianne Williamson and Dean Phillips. To answer your question, I do think it relies on building party power. It's why I am particularly interested in the Green Party right now, because Jill Stein is the only person running within the context of a party system that can do the work between elections to elect candidates down ballot, local candidates, and to also have the possibility of getting to 5% of the vote, at which point they get federal matching funds and ballot access. They make it much easier to mount even more impactful campaigns down the line. But I think the crucial thing is to get people to understand, get the American voter to understand that it is falling for the vote blue no matter who, that enables the two parties to play off of one another and offer the public less and less every single round. And if someone doesn't stop it, if someone doesn't divest from that system and buy into alternatives, I'm really fearful of where this could lead us ultimately, not just as a nation, but because of the impact of America on the global scale as an entire globe.
Amen. Give Dr. Jill my regards and best wishes, please. Briahna Joy Gray,
Will do.
It's been a joy to interview you here on the mother of all talk shows. Let's wrap up the poll. 25,000 people voted, and they voted overwhelmingly that Britain should suspend all arms sales to Israel. 97%, 89%, 88%, and 95%. Overwhelmingly, our 25,092 voters want all British arms sales to be stopped. Christina Hines says, look at all the people who offered us hope but backed down, let us down. E.g. AOC, Bernie Sanders, Howard Beckett, etc. They either back out or they change their tune. Well, not me, Christina. I'm still singing the same song I sang as a 16-year-old political activist. Farhad Razavi says, I vote for the guy who has the education and understanding of life, but sleeps somewhere in the back alley on the ground in the USA. And TCW says what they actually mean is poo-opoly. Neil Curry says they all swan around like a fan avoiding pop stars. Zero accountability, self-serving scumbags. Let's go to Eddie in Huddersfield in England on the Israeli hostages. Go ahead, Eddie.
Hi, George. Thank you for all you do. I enjoy your program. You've been discussing this now for quite a while, and since the Israeli regime insulted the Iranian government by murdering people on their territory and so on. Now, I've followed this very closely and with as much horror as anyone else. But I've listened over the last day or so to a guy whose name I just can't. It's Manya, they call him, his surname. I can't remember. I think it's Elijah or something like that. And he was being interviewed.
Oh yeah, Elijah Magnier. Yeah, he's been a guest on here.
Right, but he was explaining that he thought, then in fact, that the Palestinian resistance had in fact killed these hostages. And the reason he said that was that the last time the Israelis found hostages alive, they bombed the whole place and murdered 600 odd people. And his view was that in this case, what the Palestinian resistors are now doing is saying, okay, fine, they're going to do that again. So they would rather murder the hostages and then clear out of there. So the Israelis had no justification for bombing that. And the other thing was that about you mentioned repeatedly about the Iranian response to the Israeli attack, and he made the point about that at the moment in Israel, the population are divided greatly, and there's hundreds of thousands now on strike, and there's a lot of social disruption within Israel, and the Iranians are too clever to interrupt that. You know, you don't interfere with someone who's already self-destructing, your enemy. And so what they're waiting is to see what happens with this. And if it peters out and the population come back together to support the government, that's when they will attack them rather than interrupt their...
well, all of that is plausible, Eddie. All of that is plausible. And you'll recall that what I said in my opening remarks in my monologue was I wasn't there. Neither were you, neither was Elijah. I don't know what happened. What I do know is what Israel has done before, and I gave our pro-Israel caller from West Sussex, Friends of Israel, a round of my guns on that just half an hour ago. I know what they've done to Israeli hostages inside Gaza in the last 11 months. They murdered them. Israel murdered them in cold blood when they were holding a white flag. And an Israeli committee of inquiry has taken action against the soldiers involved this day. So it's not denied that Israel has murdered its own hostages. I don't know who killed them. I think exceedingly unlikely that the Palestinians killed them, because they are much more valuable transactionally as leverage to release 9,000 Palestinian hostages. They are much more valuable alive than dead. So I find it very difficult to believe. But the one thing above all I will say, I will never believe automatically anything that the Israeli political leadership or their shills in England, in West Sussex, or anywhere else say on their behalf. I will never believe them, because Israel has been lying from the start. The entire state is based and built upon a lie. Eddie, I've got to go. My good wife has just appeared. She's going to give us the social media roundup. What's rattling, Gayatri?
So the poll tonight asks whether Britain should suspend all arms sales to Israel. This is on the back of course, on Monday, the Foreign Secretary, David Lammy, announcing that some will be suspended. Some of the weapons export licenses to Israel will be suspended. Around 30 out of 350. It also is on the back of the Palestine action that took place, well, that has been taking place in the past year, especially, but yesterday in specific at the London offices of APCO, is it? They are the political lobbyists of Elbit System, the biggest weapons system manufacturers of Israel. So in response to this poll, which is overwhelmingly yes, of course, Olufemi says, we have done a token gesture designed to let the Labour government seem like they are doing something about Israel and the genocide of Palestinians.
But it's a walk down the middle of the road, Gayatri, and it has predictably pleased no one. No one who supports Palestine regards this as anything other than a token gesture. 9% of licenses have been stopped. And at the same time, everyone from the chief rabbi to every last pro-Israel shill is now attacking the Labour government for even suspending 9%. So they tried to walk down the middle of the road. They're now getting knocked over by cars going in both directions.
Correct. And that's why Sherry says the government is preparing something drastic. Could it be? They are just putting out headlines with the complicity of the media to pull a veil over our eyes. I do not believe what they say. Mike says, I don't get this. If a guy sells a lock knife in Britain, he'll get 5 years prison. If Lammy sells a bunch of missiles, he gets a nice little donation. Why is the obvious corruption and the business of death so acceptable? And You Can't Handle the Truth, one of our favorite handlers, says, why would Britain suspend arms sales when Israel is there, the US and the UK, Middle East project, in what they say the unthinkable aircraft
just their ally,
carrier?
it's their child. It's their illegitimate child. I could use and other words are available.
Samson, this was so interesting because obviously you had a very interesting interview with Chay Bowes, who's in Moscow, Putin, who has just been to Mongolia. We've seen some wonderful footage from it. And Samson says he traveled from Peking to Moscow via Mongolia by train, and he saw wild horses in sunset and green fields with mountains behind, and it was just truly beautiful. And I can just picture it.
Book the tickets,
yes,
Gayatri.
Very much so. Just this one from Latifa, she says, tell them, my gorgeous George, so many misinformed, brainwashed people out there. It's unbelievable. So thank you always for your fantastic, tireless work for truth, justice, and humanity. Peace and love. Thank you, Latifa.
Thank you, Latifa. Queen Latifa. I'll take it for chips. Shortly, we'll soon be finished. A final call, I think, from Anthony in Detroit on Jill Stein. Go ahead, Anthony.
Hey, George. Yeah, well, the Democrats, they're feeling the heat on this genocide issue because there's a splintering and amongst Palestine supporters. You know, the brave ones, in my view, have said abandon Harris and we'll go with Jill Stein. And then there's a kind of wishy-washy group called Uncommitted, and they're just looking for token gestures like that, like a speaking role at the DNC. And they still believe they can play the 30-year plan to reform the Democrats. But they even sent out their progressive star, AOC, to attack Jill as predatory and not authentic. I just couldn't believe that, you know, a Democrat politician who lied about Kamala Harris working for a ceasefire would call someone else inauthentic and predatory. It blew my mind.
Yeah, it blows my mind too. But if there's anyone in the entire American political universe who better fits the definition of unauthentic or inauthentic, it has to be the Barbie doll that is AOC. This woman is a preposterous fraud. I have thought so from the beginning, and her attack on Jill Stein was not just unworthy, but was a sign of desperation, as is the reinflation of the Russiagate affair. They say that they are going to crack down on Russian efforts to influence the outcome of the presidential election, when Israel has already boasted of its $100 million budget to influence the outcome of the American elections. I have no doubt at all that the Russians have got far more important things on their plates than to seek to influence whether Tweedledee or Tweedledum, whether Zion Dawn or cackling Kamala is in the White House come January. And as Briahna was pointing out, it doesn't actually really matter all that much anyway, because the policy will remain the same. The only vote for change in America is a vote for Dr. Jill Stein. I'm not a fan of Green parties normally in other parts of the world, but I know Dr. Jill very well. Me and Gayatri know her very well. She is not only the only Jewish candidate in the race, she's the only decent person amongst those who are running for president. This woman, intellectually, morally, and in every respect about the big political issues in the world and in America, is the outstanding candidate. She's the only Jew standing. She's the only supporter of the Palestinians standing, with a chance to be on almost all of the ballots, which can garner as many electoral college votes as are necessary to be elected as president. So don't tell me that a vote for Jill Stein is a wasted vote. A vote for the lesser of two evils, even if you could discern which is the lesser of two evils, that's the true wasted vote. Because you're perpetuating a system that delivers evil every time. At least since the nightmare on Elm Street in November of 1963. I wish I had time for many more calls. I'm sorry to all those who've been left hanging on the line. Tommy Two Gloves, what a great name, says, bring on Mrs. Galloway, gorgeous George. She is brilliant and lovely. She is indeed, but it's me that's taking her for chips after the show. Eat your heart out, Tommy. It's been marvellous for me. I hope it was for you. And if it was, come back on Sunday for the mothership, for the mother of all talk shows. Same time, same place on Sunday. God knows what the world will look like by Sunday. Isn't that amazing? That every night we go to sleep, we don't know what state we're going to be in the morning.